Hello, my name's Marianne Williams and I'm a specialist IBS and allergy dietitian. Thank you very much for downloading this Low FODMAP Diet treatment webinar. And today we're going to go through various sections. And what I've done is I've separated the webinar into bite-sized sections so that you can watch them each individually as and when you have time. So today, this particular section, we're going to go through background and the essential information you need to know before you start the diet. But the next sections will look at understanding how the low FODMAP diet works. We'll look at FODMAP foods, which you restrict, which you can eat. We'll look at, is the FODMAP diet suitable for those with constipation? We'll also have a bite-sized section on the FODMAP diet and your gut health. And then we'll do a summary of this restriction phase of the low FODMAP diet before moving on to the final webinar, which will look at FODMAP reintroduction and personalisation. So to move on with today, looking at the background, I want to just reiterate that this webinar or series of webinars is aimed at people with irritable bowel syndrome. So people with symptoms like diarrhea, constipation, bloating, wind, abdominal pain, nausea, gurgling, acid reflux. Those are all classic symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, and that's who this webinar is aimed at. Now, how to use this video or webinar, I'd like you to re-watch the webinar 2 or 3 times just to make sure that you've really understood and consolidated your knowledge. The low FODMAP diet is relatively complex, and I think it really benefits if you watch the information a couple of times. You can watch it in sections, so don't feel that you've got to watch it all in one go. You could pause the video, come back to sections later on, but it is very important that you do watch the whole video, all the sections, because there is important information right from the very beginning all the way to the very last webinar. So really important that you do watch them all. So the contents of this particular one, looking at background, what I'm going to cover today is red flags that you need to see your GP for, what information will not be covered in this treatment video, other GP tests that you could have if you've got a diagnosis of IBS, who should not do this diet, does food allergy cause IBS, and finally first line advice for IBS before you even consider doing the low FODMAP diet. So first and foremost, I really want to look at red flags. Now, these are symptoms that we get concerned about and that we feel that you should see your GP for as soon as possible. So if you've got blood in your stools, unexplained significant weight loss, unexplained low iron levels, a sudden change in symptoms. So for instance, you've always had constipation and suddenly in the last few months you've got diarrhea, or the other way around. Or you're waking at night regularly with your gut symptoms. Now, I don't mean waking up to go to the loo. I mean your gut symptoms are waking you up. Any of these red flags, and I really want you to not delay and go and see your GP. So before we start, the first thing I really want to be sure of is that you have a correct diagnosis of IBS, that you've been to see a GP or a consultant and been diagnosed with IBS. We don't want to find that actually you've got something else going on and that you just assumed it was IBS. So please go and get a firm diagnosis. The second point is that I'd really like everybody to watch the first line advice webinar before they venture down the FODMAP diet route. There's a free version of this webinar on the fodmapdiet.co.uk website. Please watch it. It will give you some very valuable advice, and the simple changes on there may mean that you don't need to go down the FODMAP diet route. And finally, number 3 would be going back to the point we've just covered. Please be sure that you're not suffering with any of the red flags noted in the previous slide. So, what information falls outside of this webinar? So what will I not be covering? Well, as a dietitian, I will not be looking at the pharmaceutical or medication advice, and I won't be looking at advice for non-IBS symptoms or other medical conditions. And I won't be looking at blood results or investigations. Other tests that you can have if you've got IBS that you can have with your GP are a full blood count, erythrocyte sedimentation rates, C-reactive protein, or an antibody test for celiac disease. Now, celiac disease is an autoimmune condition, which is where gluten in food affects the gut. It affects about 1% of the population, and the gut symptoms are very similar to IBS, so it's really important that this is ruled out. Other considerations before even embarking on this diet is that the success rate of the low FODMAP diet is roughly around 75%, but that means 25% of people won't get better. So there's no guarantee that the low FODMAP diet will be a solution for you. If you've got a history of food anxiety or eating disorders, then please seek professional advice before going down a restrictive diet route such as the FODMAP diet. And for some patients, stress and anxiety can be significant causes of their IBS symptoms. And if this rings true to you and you feel that these are particularly problematic for you and may be causing your IBS, then you may find that cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, or hypnotherapy or medication may be more effective than the low FODMAP diet. And finally, the consideration is that this diet is not suitable for children. There just is not enough research in it yet. I want to also touch on the fact that if you've got chronic health conditions that may affect your nutritional status, it's really important to seek advice from your medical team before you even consider doing the low FODMAP diet. So one of the questions we get asked a lot about by patients is it food allergy that is causing my IBS? Well, food allergy is caused by the immune system. It's where the immune system starts to try and attack a protein in a food. And that is not what is happening in IBS. The immune system is not involved in IBS. So therefore, allergy testing would be absolutely no use for you in finding a solution for your IBS. But what does cause IBS? Well, IBS is more about the plumbing of your guts. And in some people, simple changes can be enough to get rid of their IBS symptoms or reduce them down to a tolerable level. So things like changing your alcohol intake, your caffeine intake, spicy food, fatty food. Some people find that lifestyle changes, making sure they have 3 meals a day, not eating on the run, eating slowly, enjoying their food, not looking at digital appliances while they're eating. And for some people, conditions such as lactose intolerance can be more relevant to their symptoms. All of these factors are covered in the IBS First Line Advice webinar. So I'd really like you to watch that. That'll give you much more information on all those points I've just touched on. However, if you've tried First Line Advice and you're still suffering with symptoms, then it may be time to look at the low FODMAP diet. And I will go on with that and give you more details about that in the next section. Welcome back to the second video for the low FODMAP diet treatment. And in this video, we're going to look at understanding the low FODMAP diet. Before we get going, I want to really recommend a video that you can watch on the internet. If you type in the FODMAP Grand Tour Down Under, you'll find an extremely good video produced by Monash University, which is the home of the FODMAP diet. And I really recommend watching that because it'll give you some good background information on the plumbing issues that are caused in the gut by irritable bowel syndrome, and will explain the background to the diet really well. Monash University also have an app, although it is very based on Australian foods. King's College London used to have a UK app, but unfortunately it's not available at the moment. I would suggest that you're going to get all the information you need from these low FODMAP diet treatment videos. So at the moment, perhaps hold off on using the app at this stage because it may cause confusion due to the differences in the foods. So what does FODMAP stand for? Well, FODMAP stands for some horrible long words: fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. But in simple terms, what we're saying is that FODMAPs are a type of dietary carbohydrate which the human body finds difficult to absorb. Simple as that. Some of these FODMAPs cause water to move into the small intestine, and this extra water will then mix with your poo. So if you've already got soft poos and you add extra water, you're going to end up with very loose stools. And in some people, these foods, FODMAPs, get fermented by the gut bacteria in the lower intestine, and this fermentation can cause the gas and the wind, and that can result in bloating and stomach pain and discomfort. So to give you some examples to try and make it more understandable what we're talking about. So there's a picture of prunes at the top here. Now prunes are a FODMAP food. They cause water to enter the small intestine. Now this is really useful, of course, if your stools are hard and constipated, and that's why we give prunes to patients with constipation. But of course, giving prunes to somebody who's already got soft stools is really not going to help, because it's going to add more water into their already soft stools and give them diarrhea. Baked beans, another example. So baked beans ferment in everyone's guts. We always hear the term beans means farts, and that's because they ferment, cause gas and wind, and depending on how sensitive you are, you may produce more wind than other people. So baked beans and prunes, really good examples of FODMAPs. So understanding how the low FODMAP diet actually works. One of the questions I get asked a lot, and this may ring true for some of you watching this, is why can I eat a particular food on one day and suffer symptoms, and yet I can eat exactly the same food on a different day and it has no effect on me at all? And this is what a lot of people find really confusing, and it makes it very difficult for them to discover which foods are causing a problem. Well, I've got an answer to that. So I want you to think of an analogy. I want you to think of an overflowing bucket, okay? So every time you eat FODMAP foods, you may be adding FODMAPs into your bucket. Now, while your bucket is filling, you might have no symptoms or very low level symptoms. But when you eat too many FODMAPs in a short space of time, then your bucket may overflow, and that's when the symptoms appear. So to give you an example, somebody would say to me, look, I ate beans last week and they were absolutely fine. But I had beans this time in a different meal and they caused terrible symptoms. So here are the beans. Why? Why is that a problem? Why can I have them one week and not another? So looking at this food, you can see I've got some red arrows here. It's not just the beans that are high FODMAP here. There are several dishes here that are high FODMAP. So this meal does contain beans, but it also contains many other high FODMAP foods. So this meal in itself could cause your bucket to overflow, resulting in symptoms. And you end up blaming those symptoms on the beans, when in fact it's just that you've had too many FODMAPs in a short space of time, filled your bucket up, overflowing, and now you've got symptoms. So each person's level of tolerance is different, with some people suffering symptoms with very few FODMAPs, while others need to eat a lot of FODMAPs before they start to suffer symptoms. So it's really personal. So what do you do? Now you know the background. What do you actually do with regard to the FODMAP diet? Well, there are two different approaches with the FODMAP diet. You can do what we call a top-down approach, where you restrict all the FODMAP foods for 4 to 8 weeks, and then you do reintroduction to find your personal level of tolerance. And the emphasis there is really that you return to a normalised diet in the long term. The second approach is called a bottom-up approach, and this might be where you just reduce a few of the high FODMAP foods or target specific FODMAP foods for a limited time period, and further restriction is only used if you don't see an improvement with this approach. So with a bottom-up approach, we might look at different ideas and see if any of these ideas help. So you could look at particular fruit that appear in the FODMAP diet, and are you eating too much of one particular fruit, and could you cut it down? So for instance, I've had a patient who was eating a lot of apples. He was having stewed apple on his porridge, he was having apple juice, he was having fresh apples at other times during the day. We just cut out the apples and all his symptoms went away. So for him, a bottom-up approach, looking at one particular food, was sufficient to solve the problems. You could look at whether you suspect milk and lactose, and you could try simply swapping your ordinary milk and yogurt for lactose-free milk and yogurt and see if that helps. Or you could look at garlic and onions and try cutting back on those. Those are particularly strong FODMAPs, and sometimes just cutting back on the intake of onion and garlic can help. And are you eating a lot of wheat foods? Try cutting down or swapping to other carbohydrates such as rice, potatoes, spelt sourdough bread, for instance. Simple changes like these may be sufficient for you to do the bottom-up approach and not need to do the full FODMAP diet. So if you do feel you need to do the whole low FODMAP diet, which the majority of my patients do, what we're looking at is we're removing strictly from the diet for 4 to 8 weeks all the FODMAP foods and then reintroducing them again in a stepwise fashion. Often the FODMAP effects are not down to the consumption of just one food, but the quantity or combination of FODMAPs eaten over a short space of time or on consecutive days. So going back to those pictures I was showing you earlier, it wasn't just about the beans. That meal where the beans appeared to cause a problem was because there were actually a lot of other FODMAPs in that meal. If you feel better after following the FODMAP diet for 4 to 8 weeks, then you must start the reintroduction process. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. But it's very important that you start the reintroduction process. This is not a long-term diet and it can have a negative effect on the gut bacteria. So it's really important that you start the reintroduction process. If, however, you do not feel better after following the low FODMAP diet for 4 to 8 weeks, then simply return to your normal eating patterns. You do not need to follow the FODMAP reintroduction process. However, you may want to seek a one-to-one consultation with a specialist dietitian to look at other dietary approaches for your symptoms. Welcome back to the third episode of the low FODMAP diet treatment video. This is episode 3 where we look at the FODMAP foods. Now you will have been sent a link to a handout which is basically a copy of all the slides in this third webinar so that you have all the information available at your fingertips, because here we're going to really concentrate on the foods that you need to avoid and more positively the foods that you can safely enjoy. I'm going to start off by explaining which are the FODMAP foods that need to be restricted. They are fructans, galacto-oligosaccharides, polyols, fructose and lactose. But please don't worry about those words. We're going to go into more detail about each of those as we go along. So let's start with the negative side, as in what foods need to be avoided. Well, if we look at the fructans, there's a large array of fruit and vegetables. I'm not going to start going into each one with you because you're going to have the handout, so you'll have all that information close at hand. Other fructans are found in things like wheat flour, spelt pasta, rye flour, barley, etc. Interestingly, wheat and barley also contain another FODMAP, galacto-oligosaccharides, but the most important thing is that these flours contain fructans. Fructans are also found in some of these teas, and they're also found as prebiotics. This is the food for the gut bacteria, often labelled in foods as FOS or inulin. Galacto-oligosaccharides revolve predominantly around beans and pulses. So things like baked beans, lentils, kidney beans, etc. are all high in galacto-oligosaccharides and need to come out of the diet. Polyols cover xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol, and sorbitol is evident in quite a few fruit and some other foods. Things like sugar-free chewing gum, for instance, all of these will need to come out of the diet. And another polyol, mannitol, is found in things like cauliflower, celery, sweet potato, and some mushrooms. Fructose is the sugar found in fruit. Now, it's not in a high enough quantity in a lot of fruit to be an issue, but it is high in things like apples, pears, cherries, figs, mangoes, watermelon, and dried fruit. It's also added to some foods like yogurts and things like cranberry juice, which has a very drying effect on the palate. They add fructose syrup there to try and make it sweeter and more palatable. So you do need to read your labels. Lactose is the sugar in dairy, which is found predominantly in milk, yogurt and ice cream. And I'll go into lactose in a bit more detail in a minute. So first of all, I want to really concentrate on the fructans in wheat, barley and rye because I want to explain a little bit more background to this. So if we look at a wheat grain, in a wheat grain, you have two predominant elements, the gluten, which is the protein, and the fructans, which is the FODMAP, the carbohydrate. Now the arrow is pointing at the fructans because with the FODMAP diet, that's what we're interested in. We're not interested in the gluten. Gluten has nothing to do with the FODMAP diet. So the learning point here is that the fructans are poorly absorbed in everyone, as we have no ability to break them down. The fructans in wheat, barley and rye can cause IBS symptoms. The gluten is nothing to do with IBS. So what do you do about the foods you eat if you're taking out wheat, barley and rye? Well, gluten-free foods are very useful because you can piggyback on the back of those. It's not because the gluten, but it's because those gluten-free foods have no wheat, barley and rye in by definition, and therefore they're suitable for people to use as part of the low FODMAP diet. The type of bread that is more palatable if you don't want to use gluten-free bread is spelt sourdough bread. Now the secret here is it needs to be bread made with 100% spelt flour, no other flour, and it needs to be used to make sourdough, which takes 5 to 6 hours to prove, and during that proving process it basically breaks down any remaining FODMAPs in that, or fructans in that spelt flour, and makes spelt sourdough very suitable for FODMAP patients. It's quite difficult to find because a lot of bakers find spelt quite difficult to work with. It doesn't rise so easily, so they'll often make a spelt and rye loaf or a mixture of flours. Now you can't have that. You have to have it made with 100% spelt flour. The only shop where I know you can get that is Waitrose, which does 100% spelt sourdough. It's ready sliced in a packet, fresh, and you can buy it from the Waitrose shops. But you may also find that artisan bakers will make you some 100% spelt sourdough if you ask them to. So the alternative starchy foods that you're going to use when you're taking out wheat, barley and rye are going to be rice, rice noodles, potatoes and oats. And you can also eat buckwheat, polenta, quinoa, millet and sprouted pearl barley. And you can have barley malt extract if that's included an ingredient. Now, patients with celiac disease cannot have barley malt extract. They have to have a very, very strict gluten-free diet. But for a FODMAP patient, barley malt extract is not relevant, so you don't need to worry about it. So let's have a look at the lactose side now. I promised that I would go into this in a bit more detail. So the learning point here is that you only need to restrict lactose if you suffer with diarrhea or loose stools. If your IBS is mostly constipation dominant, then you do not need to restrict lactose and you can ignore the low lactose side of the FODMAP diet. But if you are going to do the low lactose side of the diet because you've got loose stools as part of your IBS, it's important to remember that this is not a dairy-free diet. You can still eat cheese, you can still eat butter, you can still eat cream. You don't have to restrict those in the slightest. And it's important to reiterate that IBS is not caused by allergy, as we mentioned in an earlier episode. It's not caused by dairy allergy either. So the learning point is that dairy allergy and lactose intolerance are two completely different conditions. Lactose in dairy can cause IBS symptoms, but dairy proteins, which cause dairy allergy, are not responsible for IBS. Therefore, for IBS, you only need to limit your intake of the high lactose dairy foods like milk, yogurt, and ice cream. So you could simply use the lactose-free milk and yogurt or the nut-based milks and yogurt. Plant-based milks that are suitable for the FODMAP diet would be almond milk, hazelnut milk, macadamia milk, so all those nut milks. It's important to know that some plant-based milks actually have quite a high FODMAP content, and I've listed here, and you'll see on your handout this exact page which lists the different types of plant-based milk and how much you should limit those to per session so that you don't have too much of a high FODMAP content. So let's get on to the more interesting side now. What can you eat? What fruit and vegetables can you eat? Because there seems to be such a huge list of what you can't eat that it can be easy to think, oh my Lord, I'm going to have absolutely nothing to eat now. But here is the list of what you can eat, and there are a lot. So there are plenty of suitable vegetables on the low FODMAP diet, so there's no reason to have a lack of fibre or a lack of fruit and veg in your diet. aim to have at least 3 portions of vegetables per day, and there's no upper limit on how many vegetables you can have in one sitting. One portion is about 80 grams, but to be honest, you can eat as much vegetable as you like, and all the salady vegetables like the tomatoes and the peppers and the carrot and the cucumber are all on here as well. So more FODMAP safe vegetables here. So there really is plenty for you to be having. You can have some of these which have got FODMAP content, but you have to have them in limited amounts. I tend to suggest to patients to avoid these if at all possible, but if you really need them, then choose one per meal and keep it within the limits listed on the page. And if you're on a vegetarian or vegan diet, you may well need to supplement your diet with some of these foods. And again, choose one per meal and keep to the limits listed on the page. Here's a tip. So garlic and onions, we use them a lot in cooking, and it can seem slightly overwhelming that you've got to take them out. So the alternatives are things like garlic oil, which you can buy in all the supermarkets now, chives, the green part of the spring onions, not the white part, asafoetida powder. All of these can be used to replace garlic and onion flavour, and all other herbs and spices are absolutely fine to use. Be aware that stock cubes, gravy, garlic in dressings, passata with flavourings, flavour crisps, sauces, these can all include garlic and onion. And what I will also send to you along with the PDF of all these slides is a manufacturer's list. So manufacturers who make FODMAP friendly foods, including things like gravy and stock. So hopefully you'll find that helpful. Let's look at the FODMAP safe fruit. Plenty of fruit again for you to have. Aim to eat 2 portions of fruit spread throughout the day, and 1 portion is about 80 grams. So there's plenty to have. All the citrus fruit, for instance, the melons, the berries, etc., all absolutely fine on this diet. There are some extra fruit you can have, but in limited quantities. Again, as with the vegetables, I would say try and avoid them if at all possible. But if you need to have them, then keep them within these limits listed on the page. And here's another tip about dried fruit. Generally, I would say avoid dried fruit. But if you have to have dried fruit, you can have from this list in these quantities listed here, but just 1 serving per meal. So what other foods can you eat freely? So poultry, meat, fish, all absolutely fine. You can eat those completely freely. Eggs cooked in any way, shape or form, absolutely fine. Tofu, tempeh, mycoprotein, pea protein, all absolutely safe on the low FODMAP diet. And finally, nut butters, nuts and seeds, spirulina, brown rice protein, all totally acceptable. Nuts and seeds, we tend to say keep to 1 small handful per portion. And the only nuts you can't have are cashews and pistachios. All other nuts are fine. So that finishes our roundup of all the foods that you need to avoid and the safe foods to eat. Use your handout that I sent you the link to help take you through the FODMAP diet. Thank you. Welcome to the 4th in the series of our low FODMAP diet treatment video, and in this one we're just going to concentrate on the FODMAP diet and constipation. It's a very short webinar, so just giving you some basic information. The fundamental question we get asked is, should I use the low FODMAP diet if I am constipated? Well, the FODMAP diet with some of the foods will cause water to enter the small intestine. And if this water enters the small intestine, it's going to mix with the poo in that area and potentially make this poo softer. So if you remove these foods by putting somebody on the FODMAP diet, then there's a risk that less water will enter the small intestine and the stools may become harder. So it's perfectly possible for people with constipation dominant IBS to do the FODMAP diet, but there are some really important changes they need to make alongside doing the FODMAP diet to make sure they don't actually make their constipation worse. So there are 4 things that I want a patient with constipation to do if they're going to do the low FODMAP diet. I want them to eat plenty of FODMAP safe fruit and vegetables, at least 5 portions of fruit and vegetables per day. This is really important to bulk up the stools, add extra fibre, as well as all the minerals and vitamins that go with it. But from a constipation perspective, it's bulking up those stools and making sure that the stools move through the intestines efficiently. Drinking at least 2 litres of water a day, that's really, really important, and in hot weather maybe slightly more. That doesn't include things like coffee and tea that have caffeine in, but it could include things like FODMAP safe cordials like orange and lemon cordial, or herbal teas like mint tea, etc. So it could be still water or sparkling water as well, but it must be at least 2 litres of water per day. They must eat plenty of FODMAP safe grains. So things like brown rice and oats are ideal for somebody with constipation, just to help bulk up those stools, make them softer and make them easier to pass. And the final area that I want constipated patients to concentrate on is taking regular exercise, regular daily physical movement. Now that could be just walking the dog and briskly walking the dog. So that movement will help to move the stools as well. So if you've got constipation, you want to do the FODMAP diet, that's fine, but you must make these 4 changes to ensure that you don't simply make your constipation worse. And to finish up briefly, I want to also mention, now in a previous episode, we've looked at the red flags, and if you have any of these, how I want you to go and see your GP. Now, if your constipation is a new element, you didn't have constipation until recently, you've always been somebody with loose stools, and suddenly constipation has become a problem, so you've had this sudden change in symptoms, that is a red flag, and you must go and see your GP about that and find out more and just check that there isn't something else going on. So constipation, it's always been there, you've always had constipation, you need to make the changes we've mentioned, but I wanted to also mention that if constipation is a very new thing for you, a very sudden change, then please go and see your GP about it. I hope you found this short episode on constipation and the FODMAP diet useful. Welcome to the 5th in our series of the Low FODMAP Diet treatment videos. And in this one, I'm going to look at the effects on gut health. I want to concentrate initially on an area of confusion. So a lot of people want to know, what is the difference between a prebiotic with an E and a probiotic with an O? Well, there's a very simple difference. Probiotics with the O are the actual gut bacteria, whereas the prebiotics with the E are the food for the gut bacteria. Now, FODMAPs have a lot of these prebiotics in them, but research actually indicates that with the exception of one bacteria, which is called bifidobacteria, and I'll go into that in more detail in a minute, the type and number of bacteria in the gut are not actually significantly altered by the low FODMAP diet. So despite the fact that we're removing a lot of prebiotics, it doesn't seem to have a huge effect on other bacteria in the gut. I want to just cover something that we looked at earlier on in an earlier episode, which is the national guidelines for probiotics. So probiotics, the actual bacteria. If you've got IBS, it is advised that you might want to try a 3-month trial of a probiotic. It's important to remember that the positive effects of probiotics actually wear off about 1 to 3 weeks after you stop taking them. So in essence, if they work, it looks like you need to take them long term, and of course that can be very expensive. However, probiotics may be useful if you've had gastroenteritis or taken antibiotics, but the jury's still out on exactly how much probiotics will benefit your IBS symptoms. So looking at the gut health, one of the questions we get asked a lot is, will the low FODMAP diet be bad for my gut bacteria? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it does appear that low FODMAP diet reduces a bacteria called bifidobacteria, but this appears to only be effective in the short term, and no other bacteria seem to be affected by the diet. Recent research suggests that those bifidobacteria actually look as though they return to normal once you start the reintroduction process. But it does emphasise that you really mustn't do the diet for longer than 8 weeks, and that the reintroduction process is absolutely essential. A lot of people would say, well, if bifidobacteria is reduced by the diet, why don't I just take a probiotic with bifidobacteria while I'm on the low FODMAP diet? So I want to finish this section by saying that at the moment, there just simply is not enough evidence to recommend that patients should take a probiotic alongside the low FODMAP diet. But we wait for more research to come out in the future. I hope you found this section useful on gut bacteria. Welcome to the 6th in our series on the low FODMAP diet treatment video. In this one, I want to summarise the restriction phase of the FODMAP diet, the really important points that you must know when following the FODMAP diet. First and foremost, the diet is for a maximum of 8 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks, absolute maximum, and reintroducing FODMAPs is essential to protect your gut bacteria. Remember that symptoms can be determined by the number of FODMAPs eaten over a 24 to 48 hour period, and everybody has a personal threshold tolerance level. So each person will be different as to how many FODMAPs they can tolerate before they suffer symptoms. Remember, the diet is not suitable for children, and it's not for those with chronic health conditions unless they've got support from the medical team, and it's not for those with food-related anxiety. There are also 2 different approaches you could use to the FODMAP diet. You could use the top-down approach where you restrict all the FODMAPs for the 4 to 8 week period, or you could use the bottom-up approach where you restrict only certain FODMAPs. And it's important to look at the episode that covers that so that you can decide which is most suitable for you. Those suffering with constipation must ensure that they drink sufficient fluid, take exercise and eat sufficient fibre. And if you've got constipation dominant IBS, please listen to the episode on the FODMAP diet and constipation for some more ideas. So it's important to ask yourself certain questions if the low FODMAP diet does not appear to have worked for you. So the first and obvious question to ask would be, did you follow the diet strictly for the 4 to 8 week period? Were you a bit lax? Could that explain why the FODMAP diet didn't work? The second question to ask is, have all other causes of your symptoms been ruled out? So are you suffering with symptoms that actually need investigation, or you've got some red flags that we've mentioned before in previous episodes? Please go and see your GP. Or have you been checked for celiac disease, which can have symptoms very similar to IBS? All of these areas must be ruled out. If you haven't improved on the FODMAP diet, check that there isn't another cause for your IBS. The third point is that if you suffer from stress and anxiety, and these seem to be one of the main causes for your symptoms, then the FODMAP diet might actually not be the best approach for you. The fourth point would be look at expectations. Even the most successful cases with the FODMAP diet are unlikely to see all symptoms resolve. But what we're looking for is symptoms to come down to a level where you're comfortable and your quality of life is improved. The fifth and final point would be, if you haven't improved on the FODMAP diet, do you actually need to seek a specialist dietetic advice to look at other dietary interventions that may be suitable for your symptoms? So if the FODMAP diet hasn't worked, there are often other dietary approaches that specialist dietitians can use, and it's important to seek help with that. I hope you found this summary useful, and the next episode will look at the FODMAP reintroduction process and personalisation. Welcome to the final in our series on the low FODMAP diet treatment video. You'll have done step 1 of the FODMAP diet now, where you've restricted the FODMAP foods. Now we're going to look at step 2 and step 3. Step 2 is the FODMAP reintroduction, and step 3 is FODMAP personalisation. Now you will have been sent a link to a handout with a copy of all the slides from this section so that you've got something to follow at home. So we know that the diet is for a maximum of 8 weeks, but what people don't necessarily know is why it is so important that we reintroduce the FODMAP foods. It's really important because it helps us identify which FODMAPs we are most sensitive to, because it almost certainly won't be all FODMAPs, and you don't want to be restricting your diet unnecessarily. It also allows us to identify how much of each FODMAP you can tolerate, and it allows us to increase the variety in our diet and return to more normal eating in the long run. And that's really important because any restrictive diet is incredibly socially isolating. It's difficult with shopping, it's difficult entertaining. It's really important that we get back to normal eating. And generally within about 6 months of finishing the diet, most people are back to normal eating with the knowledge they've gained from this reintroduction process. Finally, the really important point about reintroduction is that it protects your gut bacteria, and we've covered that in previous episodes, but it's very important you do the reintroduction to protect that gut bacteria. So what is the actual strategy when you challenge or reintroduce FODMAP foods? Well, it's actually really quite simple. On day 1, you eat a challenge food. If you get no symptoms, you double the portion on day 2. And if you still get no symptoms, you triple the portion on day 3. And if you get no symptoms at that point, you stop that food, remove it, and move on to test the next food. The important aspect is to look at if you do get symptoms. So if you get symptoms at any point, you stop, you remove the food, you make a note so that you can remember, and you wait for 3 days without symptoms before you move on to challenge with the next food. Now, the time at which this happens is really important. So for instance, if you were reintroducing onions and you didn't get any symptoms until day 3, then actually you know that the amounts you ate on day 1 and 2 can be tolerated, but only if you overdo it with onions and you eat lots of them on consecutive days do you start to run into trouble. So it's all about you learning your personal tolerance level to each of the FODMAP foods. The really important thing with the FODMAP foods is that you are only having one FODMAP at a time. So when you challenge with a food, it's really important that when you finish the challenge process, you remove that food. Even if you tolerated it really well, you must remove it from the diet before you move on to test the next food. So in essence, you're staying on the strict FODMAP diet throughout this challenge process. So looking at some of the foods that we're looking at that you test individually. So fructans are a section of FODMAPs where people will respond in different ways to each of the different fructans potentially, and therefore every single fructan needs to be tested individually. So we suggest with wheat that you do 1 slice of bread on day 1, or with pasta 5 tablespoons of pasta, or with a Weetabix 1 Weetabix, and that's your day 1 amount, and then you would double it and triple it. With garlic, it's 1/4 of a clove on day 1 mixed into a low FODMAP meal, and again you double it and triple it. With onions, it's 1 tablespoon on day 1 mixed into a low FODMAP meal, and then you double it and triple it over the next 2 days. So I would say from a pragmatic point of view, with other fructans that you're going to have to test, things like Brussels sprouts, globe artichoke, leeks, okra, Savoy cabbage, etc., it's probably best to look at trying half your normal daily amount on day 1, and then perhaps move into your normal daily amount on day 2, and then perhaps 1.5 times your normal daily amount on day 3. So those are the fructans. Now, interestingly, with other FODMAPs, you often only have to challenge with one FODMAP to test your response of how you might respond to all the FODMAPs in that group. So if we looked at galacto-oligosaccharides, which are your beans, lentils and pulses, the suggestion is that you could do day 1 either butter beans or chickpeas, 40 grams of either on day 1, and double and triple that over the 3 days. And that would give you your answer to galacto-oligosaccharides generally. So you don't have to test each one individually. Fructose is the same. You could test with just honey or mango, and the quantity suggested here for day 1, and that would tell you generally whether you're going to tolerate fructose. Lactose, exactly the same. Test with 1, either milk or yogurt in the amounts noted on the sheets, and that will give you your answer as to whether you're sensitive to lactose. Polyols, sorbitol polyols, we're looking at you testing with avocado or corn on the cob, and your tolerance level of either of those will tell you your tolerance level of sorbitol foods generally. Equally, mannitol, we suggest that you test with cauliflower or celery or sweet potato in the amounts suggested, and that will give you your answer as to how sensitive you are to mannitol. So each person's tolerance threshold to a different FODMAP food will be different. So everybody's different. If somebody can tolerate up to 2 days of onion, somebody else might be able to tolerate up to 3 days of onion. It is totally individual. So I want to look at step 3, which is the FODMAP personalisation. Now, once you've done the reintroduction process, It will then be a case of you personalising your diet with the knowledge you've gained through the reintroduction process. So I still want you to regularly eat foods that you've tolerated, but perhaps keep to a minimum those that cause symptoms. So that knowledge of what you've tolerated and what you haven't during the reintroduction process is going to give you the basis of what you're going to eat moving forward. Don't forget in the long term that symptoms can be determined by the number of FODMAPs eaten over 24 to 48 hours, and there's a personal tolerance threshold level for each person. But really important to remember that actually eating too many FODMAPs might well cause you symptoms, but it's not going to damage your gut. So if you've got that wedding or that special celebration, or you're going out to somebody's house and it's just too awkward to say that you can't have certain foods, you know that you will probably suffer with symptoms the next day or the next 2 or 3 days, but you know why. And that's what's really important with the FODMAP diet. You are not damaging your gut. It's just that if you eat these foods, you are likely to suffer with symptoms. So I just want to say that I hope you have really found this low FODMAP diet treatment video and the series of bite-sized videos really helpful with how to follow the FODMAP diet. And if you need any help in the future, please don't hesitate to contact me with the email below. Thank you.